Tantor Audio, an RB Media audio brand, presents Bufalino, Revelations of a Mafia Family, the Teamsters, and the Final Resting Place of Jimmy Hoffa, by Charles Bufalino. Narrated by Charles Bufalino. RB Media is the largest audiobook publisher in the world. Find your next great listen and get exclusive offers at rbaudio.com. For the Family. Forward, Generations and Scions, by Meyer Lansky II, with S.J. Petty. Charles Bufalino, scion of the Bufalino family in Pittston, Pennsylvania, and a relative of Pennsylvania crime boss Russell Bufalino, has produced a strikingly intimate portrait of his family. There is Mary Buff, his father's cousin, who was like a second mother to him. Then her brother, Angelo, who was known throughout his life as Yabo and admired by Charles for his physical courage and his principles. And there's Russell, who became the feared mob boss, his distant cousin, period. Aunt Mary Buff was the one who gave the Bufalino children their first sips of wine, made them pizza, taught them card games, and tutored them in conversational Italian. She was extremely proud of her family, but always told Charles that members in his branch of the family were the good Bufalinos. Maybe so, but they were fiercely loyal to their blood kin and wouldn't dream of turning them in to the law. Coming up from humble beginnings of working Pennsylvania coal mines, and at times clashing with the United Mine Workers, the Bufalino crime family was able to achieve its success through connections in its family's early neighborhood businesses. The Bufalino brothers' grocery store, delicatessen, and butcher shop were the foundation that grew the family's name and reputation beyond the neighborhood, with Russell Bufalino ultimately working in step with the five families of New York. The Bufalino story is a history of Italian immigrants in Pennsylvania, from the Padrone system that enabled immigrants to pay for the expensive voyage to the United States to the dangerous coal mines where they found work. When Russell Bufalino was linked to a truckload of stolen color television sets in the 1960s, Charles was embarrassed when his school chum saw the news and asked him if he could get one of those TV sets. He asked Aunt Mary Buff if they were related to this guy. She denied it. That childhood experience is typical for the descendants of powerful gangsters. There are so many questions with no answers. They grow up understanding that there are secrets in their families. They know that there are many things they don't know. They also know that there are just some things they should never ask about. In this book, Charles has set out to uncover some of those secrets. He has spoken to family members, pored over dusty records, and reached out to experts. One day, he listened to a young scholar give a presentation on the bombings that accompanied the Union strikes in coal mines in the early 20th century. Imagine how he felt when he asked the presenter if there was any town or street that experienced more than its share of bombings. The presenter didn't even have to consult his data. Without skipping a beat, he answered, Railroad Street in Pittston, Pennsylvania, Charles Bufalino's Street, or, as Charles puts it, Murder Street. Brutal, bloodthirsty violence was part of his family history. In the Bufalino family, Russell didn't particularly stand out. He had a gruff, tough guy demeanor. He came to power when he was 47 years old. He didn't kill anybody to get to the top. He was given the top spot because the family only trusted their own, and because no one else in the family wanted their children in that life. Russell Bufalino was an orphan. What had been a crippling disadvantage became his advantage. Russell Bufalino was connected enough that he was the man who drove Vito Genovese out of the critical Appalachian Summit in 1957. He was at Joe Colombo's side when he was shaking down producers of The Godfather when they were trying to make the movie in New York. He personally taught Marlon Brando the demeanor and behaviors of a Don in the style of his own predecessors. As much as he tried to keep a low profile, he was on the radar of federal authorities. To them, Russell Bufalino was one of the most ruthless crime bosses in the country. Because he was so strong in labor racketeering, those same authorities considered him the top suspect in the mysterious disappearance of famed Teamsters Union leader Jimmy Hoffa. The Bufalino ties to Hoffa were part of a family legend. Charles's cousin, Yabo, was a sometime bodyguard to Hoffa. His father's cousin, Bill Bufalino, was tough and smart enough to become the Teamsters' business agent. Bill actually implicated the CIA in Hoffa's disappearance. While Bill Bufalino counseled Hoffa for more than 25 years on issues related to racketeering charges, sponsoring casinos in Las Vegas, and what to say under oath to Bobby Kennedy, it was Russell Bufalino who would be considered a suspect in the disappearance of Hoffa himself. The case has never been closed. Russell, in fact, proved elusive for law enforcement. They were convinced he had a hand behind the scenes in major events. One theory that federal authorities put out there was that Russell Bufalino knew about the Mafia's role in the plot to assassinate Cuban leader Fidel Castro. They believed that he was worried about the fates of Chicago mob bigwig Sam Giancana and Los Angeles mobster Johnny Roselli, who were reportedly involved in the assassination attempt. Any discussion of Cuba has to include Meyer Lansky, although he didn't show up anywhere in the theories about attempts to kill Castro. Lansky understood Cuba. He was the man who cleaned up casinos for Cuban strongman Fulgencio Batista, the man who fled Cuba after the revolution led by Castro. Lansky loved the island. No gangster understood Cuba better than he did, so much so that FBI agents sat rapt as he explained the political situation to them. It's likely that Meyer and Russell knew each other, as their world was in reality a small one. But Lansky, like Bufalino, never talked about murder or assassination plots. Both men understood it was important to keep their own counsel. That was absolutely the right course to take in the world they inhabited. One wrong word could get them killed, or worse, a precious family member could be killed. But for their families, their children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews, the questions linger. Charles Bufalino has set out to answer those questions. In a way, his quest is not so unusual. Most families have secrets, but in families like his, the secrets are big. It's likely that both Bufalino and Lansky would have counseled their families to leave it alone. It's best not to disturb those ghosts. Charles Bufalino may be doing just that. Meyer Lansky II is the grandson of Meyer Lansky and author of The Lansky Legacy, The Life and Letters of Meyer Lansky. Introduction. A Family Matter. I began researching my family in earnest in the 2010s to disprove an unsettling belief that had become a burden. Living as I was in the Pittston homestead at the time, clearing up my mother's affairs, I had a series of interactions and made a few chance discoveries that presented a bizarre, compelling, and unsettling possibility. I came to believe that I knew something nobody was intended to know about the last chapters of the Jimmy Hoffa disappearance. It bothered me enough that I set out to prove to myself that my theory could not possibly be true. I went beyond the oral traditions of my family into the written record to sort out the relationships we had to the larger organization, the original Pittston crime family. I traced our path from Sicily to America and the career paths of Russell Bufalino, Bill Bufalino, and a large body of uncles and aunts to see how they fit in with the events that led to Hoffa's disappearance. I'm still stuck with my theory. You may come to agree or not. My suspicion may be disproved by some discovery in the future. All the same, even if there is some final discovery concerning Hoffa's remains, you might wish my version was the true story. But you'll need to know some Pittston family history first and get to know the players and the action in Detroit that week at the end of July 1975 when Jimmy Hoffa went missing. The Pittston family has a double meaning to me. First, it's the Bufalino crime family. Like all the 5 families of New York, the FBI assigned names were applied based more on the 1950s headman than for the people who had established the gangs decades before. Before it acquired Russell's name as the Bufalino crime family, when it was plain that some organization was in charge of bootlegging and racketeering in the coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania, it was informally named for the center of the activity, the city of Pittston, Pennsylvania. Certainly, the name Pittston family postdates the original Black Hand label, which was widely used across the country generically in the early 1900s to describe the immigrant Sicilian extortion rings, the way we use the word Mafia today as the generic name for American gangsters and racketeers. For simplicity and clarity's sake, whenever I talk about the larger organized effort headed cooperatively by Santovalpi, Stefano, Steve Latour, and Calogero Bufalino, Russell's uncle, in any time from 1903 forward through Russell's tenure and beyond, I'm going to call it the Pittston family. Just know that when I do that, it's synonymous with other names, including Men of Montedoro, which was a local law enforcement label that got used in the McClellan testimony, and the Bufalino crime family, which is the FBI's final label. The FBI also used the acronym RABFAM as a name for investigations related to the Russell A. Bufalino crime family. But for purposes of my narrative, it's going to be the Pittston family, a cooperative syndicate anchored early on by Calogero Bufalino, Russell's uncle, Stefano Latore, and Santovalpi. The second meaning of the Pittston family, as I use it, is it's my family, the Bufalino brothers' family. Salvatore Bufalino, Bill's father and my granduncle, laid the groundwork for the Pittston family as one of the first sets of boots on the ground in the Pittston, Pennsylvania coalfields. My granduncle Salvatore and my grandfather Niccolo were associates of Calogero Bufalino and later business partners in his legitimate operations in the south side of Pittston. Another granduncle, Rosario, is also part of the Bufalino brothers, but may have had less of a hand in Calogero's business. When I speak of any of them, I'll use the label Bufalino brothers. To clarify their relationship to the Pittston family, the men of the Bufalino brothers were satellites of Calogero Bufalino, who was one of the founding and leading members of the Pittston crime family. Although relationships existed between the Bufalino brothers and other members of the Pittston family, especially Santovalpi, their primary relationship was through Calogero. I never did adequately disprove my belief about the closing chapters of the Hoffa story. Everything I have found makes it more plausible, even poetic in a grotesque sort of way. But to understand that, you have to have some background in the relationships between Bill, Russell, a few key players in the supporting family, and the as yet undocumented relationships that existed between the Bufalino crime family and the Detroit Partnership. It's also going to be helpful to understand that from the very first, the Pittston family's peculiar specialty was in union affairs. First, battling against the United Mine Workers of America, the UMWA, then against the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU, until finally they worked their way into the Teamsters Union. In union matters, they eventually walked both sides of the street and profited one way or another from having roles in labor and management, which they often occupied at the same time. It's a little unsettling to put forth my theory about the last chapter of the Hoffa disappearance because I could be as wrong as everyone else is, but I can confidently set the record straight about so many ill-reported or outright false narratives about Russell Bufalino, his influence, his rise, the family of which he was a part, his relationship to Bill and the Teamsters, and more. At the very least, I can outline the history of the Pittston family from a mix of family tradition validated by press reporting. I invite you to test the facts to see if they add up at all in support of my personal belief. Is Jimmy Hoffa hiding in plain sight in Pittston, Pennsylvania? You may well come to answer as I do. Where else would he be? Chapter 1. The Bufalino Brothers. William Eugene Bill Bufalino, Teamsters Local 985 president and Jimmy Hoffa associate, and my father were direct contemporaries, first cousins, childhood neighbors, and children of two of the three Bufalino men whose first business was a combined grocery and deli butcher shop in the old wooden floor corner lot property operating under the name Bufalino Brothers. With Bill's father Salvatore at the fore, the brothers were lauded for their industry and as examples of the rewards of hard work. By the end of the 1920s, they would own most of a solid half block of commercial properties on Railroad Street in the anthracite, hard-coal boomtown of Pittston, Pennsylvania. Mary Buff was Bill Bufalino's sister. She always said we were the good Bufalinos. I trusted her opinion. Born in 1908, as the third of my granduncle Salvatore's children, she chose not to marry on the death of her mother, Lugina Galanti, in 1924, but rather to stay at home and help raise her younger brothers, Bill, age 5, Eugene, James, and Angelo, age 11. From the day it was completed, Mary occupied the other half of the double-block home her father Salvatore and my grandfather Niccolo built, with money on loan from Russell's uncle, Calogero, to house their families and businesses. I was a latchkey kid in the 1960s. Mary was our next-door neighbor in the double-block brick house on Railroad Street in Pittston. I came to know her as a second mother when my parents were at work at my father's photography studio. Through measles, mumps, and a few pretend illnesses, I sat on her couch watching TV or at her table learning the Italian language, playing cards, and otherwise sharing time with a close relative. I was often in her company. Mary was my primary source for family lore, although other family, including my father, Angelo, Mary's brother, Yabo, another Angelo, my father's cousin, and various more distant uncles and aunts contributed their parts to the picture of life at the homestead and on the street they called Murder Street. Bill Bufalino of Hoffa fame knew Mary more as a mother than a sister from age 5. Throughout his life, he sought her approval and attention. Because of that, Mary received a steady stream of mail from her sister, Adeline, Bill's legal secretary, which included newspaper clippings, drafts of letters, photographs, framed cartoons from the Detroit Free Press, Teamsters publication, and whatever else involved Bill. I got to see them all, or hear about Bill's exploits from Mary. As for the family narrative, which became my own backstory and belief system to bring me to adulthood with a sense of family pride and self, it went like this. Salvatore Bufalino, Mary and Bill Bufalino's father, my grandfather Niccolo Bufalino, and a third brother named Rosario were coal miners who established businesses in Pittston, Pennsylvania, starting with a butcher shop on Railroad Street. They grew to own a general store and a soda factory, both housed in the ground floor cellar spaces of the current house. Salvatore founded the Montedoro Society and reinstituted the Feast and Procession of the Blessed Mother, a tradition of Sicily, among the citizens from central Sicily who lived in Pittston. A great many of Pittston's Sicilian population emigrated to the United States and settled in Pittston through Salvatore's efforts in what the family referred to as a kind of homespun travel agency. Salvatore was literate and conversant in English, which made him an advocate for the Italian immigrants to the region, who numbered in the thousands. My own grandfather, Niccolo, was less literate and sociable. He ran a number of the family business concerns, including a speakeasy that he operated out of the Montedoro Society during Prohibition. On the basis of their father's refinement and position in the community, Mary and Yabo were not always able to maintain a certain distance between themselves and generally everybody else. But it did not rankle. It went with the territory. They led, we followed. I got it. As far as the Mafia went, well, we shot at them. At least my grandfather had potted off shots to prevent the bombing of property adjacent to ours. The Bufalino brothers were a thing in the local papers, lauded for their industry and ability to bootstrap themselves into the American dream. It all came to an end for the Bufalino brothers with the onset of the Great Depression, when Salvatore's willingness to extend credit at the general store and other financial and familial downturns ruined the family's fortune. On the question of Russell's kinship, he was a distant cousin, period. That was everything I knew about us all, until Russell passed and a number of authors started writing about the family. Until 2011, in my mind, Bill was the star, Russell the black sheep, and I was closer by far to the accomplished Teamsters attorney and labor leader Bill than I was to Russell. We were the good guys. Mary passed suddenly in 1981 when I was working 2 jobs. She died within a dozen hours, stricken with diabetic shock before I could even visit her in hospital. I felt guilty about having delayed my visit. So when Mary's brother Yabo returned permanently from Detroit to occupy the homestead upon his own and Bill's retirement, I pretty much haunted him, checking in on a near-daily basis. I understood that Yabo had a certain history. I used to joke that he drove a beer truck during Prohibition, but in reality the payload was probably whiskey. I further knew from Mary that Yabo had at one time suffered a nervous breakdown and had been briefly institutionalized. He went to Detroit with Bill in the 40s, had a job as a millwright, and frequently accompanied Bill and Hoffa in their travels. He wore Hoffa's money belt when they traveled on business. My own father's health was in decline by the time Yabo returned home. Yabo was a good sounding board for me as I started my career locally and was a big-framed bully of a man. I was happy to have him guarding the approaches across the yard to the house, even at his age. But apart from echoing many of the family narratives about his father's arrival and other stories, Yabo did not contribute much to the core knowledge about the family, and I did not pry. I wasn't writing a book, after all, and I didn't want to stir up any untoward memories, just in case they bothered Yabo because, well, Yabo always seemed just a little haunted. I thought Russell's passing in 1994 would bring an end to the notoriety of the family name. Instead, Russell Bufalino's legend only grew with the release of Charles Brandt's I Heard You Paint Houses, the well-researched Informer Journal article entitled Men of Montedoro, and ever more publications, not all of which had their facts exactly right so far as I could tell. I took it all in and bit my tongue rather than comment. Then a series of closely timed small unveilings led me to an uncomfortable belief that my family, my relatives, had a direct role in the closing chapter of the Hoffa disappearance. I researched the family a little deeper. I compared known facts to the family oral traditions and written records, hoping to learn some counter-narrative that would help me dismiss my suspicion. I failed. Chapter 2. The Mortician's Tale.
Margaret Bufalino, you are going to heaven with your boots on.
Father Giulio Serra of St. Rocco's Church in Pittston knew what he was talking about. My father was a professional portrait photographer whose candid wedding work frequently put him in St. Rocco's Church and often at odds with Father Serra. The source of the conflict was that during any given wedding celebrated by Father Serra in his own church, Serra believed that he was in charge of the proceedings. My father was of a contrary opinion, seeing as how his whole reputation as a popular photographer was on the line each and every time he snapped the shutter. Ladders in the church? No problem. How else was he going to get the wide shot? Need to change batteries? Call for a pause. No problem. My father's philosophy was that the bride was going to end up hating him one way or the other, either at the church or when she picked up her wedding album. He always chose the first option. It was a half-friendly, semi-respectful rivalry he had with Father Serra, and it led the priest to absolve my mother of every life sin, just for having to deal with my old man. In 2011, my mother, the last of her generation to occupy the Pittston homestead, passed away. Shortly after her passing, I had an encounter that would be the first of 3 related mini-reveals, conversations and chance discoveries that led me to a belief I couldn't dismiss. They occurred, one shortly after the other, aligned on one theme, and concluded within a few months of her funeral. The funeral home was well known to my family and to many others in the closely knit Sicilian community of Pittston, Pennsylvania. Generations of Italian and Sicilian families had been waked there, and the home itself had multiple generations of family operators. Many similar funeral homes had their start in the anthracite coal mining era when the coal company Black Maria hearses would simply deposit the scorched or torn and mangled bodies of miners on the front porch and drive away, often without so much as a knock. They were followed by enterprising funeral operators leaving business cards with the family suggesting that I can help you with that. In this funeral parlor, I had attended the wakes of the 2 prior generations of Bufalinos and their related families in the close company of Russell Bufalino, his entourage, and the ever-present contingent of FBI agents who dutifully recorded, by the light of their flashlights, the license plates of every car in attendance. I had personally made the arrangements for my mother's wake, so I was not surprised when the funeral director made his way toward me in the vestibule. He directed my attention toward a mantel in the front parlor, toward 2 rough-looking cement or concrete molded vases. You see those 2 memorial vases? I nodded toward them. Bill Bufalino gave them to me. I was nodding in assent, listening. He had a hobby of making memorial vases. I was still nodding yes, but my mind was rejecting the possibility that Bill had a hobby of making memorial vases. I could more easily have accepted the belief that Bill had the vases made by someone else to present to the family that owned the funeral parlor, but they did seem a little plain-looking for that to be the case. Of course, I could be wrong, and Bill's family might to this day be shuttling cement or concrete memorial vases around their yard using them to store garden tools, but I had legitimate reason to doubt. It ran through my mind that Mary would have had one, and I would have seen it somewhere in her house. I knew standing there that anything Bill Bufalino ever did or accomplished somehow ended up in Mary's house, courtesy of Bill's sister, Adeline, who served as Bill's legal secretary. And whatever it was, a newspaper article about some union matter in Texas or wherever, or the letter Bill drafted to the Italian authorities on the occasion of Russell's near deportation, I, as Mary's cousin, charge, and neighbor, would have seen it. I was frequently in Mary's company as a child, and Mary held nothing back. Bill regarded Mary as his mother. He had referred to Mary in his World War II Army last will and testament in just those terms. Absent the appearance of a single memorial vase or artifact of any kind made of cement at Mary's house, cellar to attic, I was dubious about what I was hearing, but I kept nodding to be polite. Wow, that is very cool. The vases were obviously a treasured artifact in the family that ran the funeral home. I knew Bill much better than I knew Russell. Even so, most of my experience of Bill was gathered during the years of Jimmy Hoffa's incarceration in Lewisburg, Pennsylvania, and the few years thereafter that Bill maintained a law practice below Mary's apartment. Bill would routinely, he himself said weekly, travel from Detroit to Lewisburg to consult with Hoffa in the company of either his son, William Bufalino II, or Yabo, Angelo, his brother. Lewisburg and its prison being just 90 minutes from Pittston, Pennsylvania, Bill would often schedule some time to visit his sister at the homestead, take care of local legal matters, and maybe commiserate with Russell in person to avoid wiretaps. I liked Bill Buff. Most people did. You would have liked him. He was entertaining. My father, his direct contemporary, first cousin, and lifelong neighbor, could never get enough of Bill talking about, well, being Bill Buff and taking on the Kennedys in a half-decade of hearings. When I think of Bill, I think raconteur, wit, orator, fighter, lawyer. But craftsman? I didn't see that in him. I could be wrong. As implausible as the funeral director's story seemed, I never thought for a second that he was making it up. He believed what he was saying, and I had no reason to doubt him. Certainly, Bill was well known to the mortician's family. He graduated school with one of the former directors of the funeral home. The current funeral director has a full inventory of family stories involving Bill and Russell dating back generations. I took the story about the memorial vases as presented and got busy with other family business. I forgot about it. Chapter 3. What to Call This Thing of Ours. The New York State Police raid on the Appalachian meeting in November 1957 at Joseph Barbara's upstate New York estate exposed the existence of an active and organized underworld. The raid forced FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover to finally acknowledge what he had denied for years, that there was an organized body behind the individuals the FBI had identified as it poked around the edges of the larger organization through its Top Hoodlum program. Russell Bufalino had been profiled by that program in the early 1950s, well before the New York State Police raid on the Appalachian meeting exposed the existence of the American Mafia. Hoover's reluctance to pursue organized crime as a body mystified many, including his own number 3 man, William Sullivan, author of The Bureau, My 30 Years in Hoover's FBI. In the 1950s, columnist Jack Anderson embarrassed Hoover by exposing the scope of a wide network Hoover had refused to acknowledge. The Top Hoodlum program only skipped across the surface, but it allowed Hoover to say he was doing something in case anyone should ask. Several sources explain Hoover's reluctance to pursue the broader organization as a personal and professional survival mechanism. That is to say, the mob had something on Hoover that would end his career. For Michael Benson, author of Gangsters vs. Nazis, it was Meyer Lansky who possessed compromising photos of Hoover and his close aide, Clyde Tolson. The blogosphere adds more voices to the same opinion, but I hesitate to name the parties in case they take offense or recant their position. For my own family, I can only report the words of my father, a professional photographer who often traveled to do work for Russell in the 1950s. What inspired him to say it? I don't know. If there was a conversation that preceded his statement, I don't remember it. All I remember is my father saying, "We have pictures of Hoover in a dress." I did wonder about his use of the word we, since we were the good Buffs, after all. Now that Hoover was stuck with the existence of this apparently countrywide criminal organization, thanks to the efforts of a few New York State police troopers, he had to call it something. Mafia would not do, since every time the word appeared or was uttered, it might expose his own steadfast resistance to acknowledge its existence. Some have suggested that it was Joseph Valachi's testimony that offered the term La Cosa Nostra as the formally accepted name of the organization overseen by the Commission. It's also possible that Valachi used the term at Hoover's request. One long-lost reference from my own research suggests that Hoover lifted the phrase from a wiretapped conversation between two individuals who spoke in Italian about this thing of ours in terms of a particular business venture between them. Fringe opposition to JFK as a candidate for the presidency in 1960 was based in part on his Roman Catholicism. The most paranoid among the electorate feared, however irrationally, that a President Kennedy might turn the country over to the Pope. In that atmosphere of anti-Catholic sentiment, La Cosa Nostra, with all those vowels, had the right ring to garner public and congressional support and funding for the Bureau in perpetuity, or at least through the end of Hoover's career. Moreover, it spared Hoover the embarrassment of having to admit he'd been wrong about the existence of anything like the Mafia. He used the term, La Cosa Nostra phrase, as often as possible, even in abbreviation, to title investigations of criminal activity under the umbrella acronym of LCN. Today, La Cosa Nostra and American Mafia, or just Mafia, are used interchangeably. Some will swear that Cosa Nostra is an age-old name for the Sicilian Mafia. Whatever they say. I'm just pointing out that Hoover used the term La Cosa Nostra to change the game on anybody who suggested he dropped the ball regarding the Mafia. When the FBI's post-Appalachian investigations led them to evidence suggesting Russell was not a native-born citizen, the government began a deportation process against Russell, which led to appeals that lasted all through the early 1970s. The United States first sought to deport Russell either to Brazil or Italy. Evidence presented by Russell's defense included an orphan's court birth registry in Luzerne County, Pennsylvania, and school records, along with the testimony of his uncle and siblings. The government was able to answer these as being inconsequential, since they had obtained a birth record from Montedoro, Sicily. Given Russell's clear, lifelong ties to the United States, the government sought to strengthen its case on the basis that Russell was not a person of good moral character, which they probed by questioning Russell about his pursuits and employment. Russell Bufalino explained his lack of a visible means of support in one of his innumerable deportation hearings by replying, "I have a rich uncle who takes care of me." They asked about his school history, his employment history, and his current profession at Penn Drape in Pittston, Pennsylvania. What does an expediter do, exactly? One result of protracted hearings in 1965 was an 82-page opinion rendered by William B. Taffet, who determined that Russell had not been, during the entire course of these proceedings, a person of good moral character. He said Bufalino's testimony during the lengthy case had been a maze of contradictions as to employment, occupational activities, and sources of income. Throughout the often and well-publicized deportation process, Russell's increasing notoriety haunted nearly everybody with the Bufalino name. It especially made for interesting times among those of us at the homestead, the Pittston contingent. We were taking Russell's heat in school, at work, at large. We waited through the 1970s to step out of the shadow of suspicion, held our breath in the 1980s as Russell moved out of circulation in the newspapers, and thought it was all over at last when, in 1994, Russell passed. Russell was not lying or being coy about having an uncle who took care of him. He really did have a rich uncle who had directed his actions and career from the earliest age. That uncle was among a few who built an empire out of gambling and bootlegging and other more legitimate pursuits that Russell would come to run in his own right and under his own name. Even Russell's nickname, the Old Man, came to him in direct line of succession, straight from the first Old Man, his uncle, who acquired it himself in the most natural of ways. Russell probably acquired or adopted the nickname while still relatively young, acting as his uncle's proxy during his own rise to influence in the coal fields of northeastern Pennsylvania in the 1920s and 30s. Of Russell's legend and influence, Charles Brandt has been quoted as saying, He was one of the most powerful mob bosses of his day, if not of all time. Russell's own chosen successor, William Delia, has suggested that Russell's power was above that of the commission itself. It's difficult for me as an extended family member to fathom all of that, but the more I looked, the more I discovered that Russell had the kind of reach, influence, and support to sway and profit from human experiences from the basest to the most accultured. He was in life and death a man of mystery, even if especially to those who thought they knew him best. It's generally accepted that Russell had a role in the Hoffa disappearance. His own chosen successor, William Delia, claims in his biography, The Life We Chose, by Matt Birkbeck, that he is as much in that belief as any other authority. As for Brandt and Sheeran's assertion that Russell Bufalino had a role in the Kennedy assassination, I'm willing to be wrong, but I'm not a buyer. I believe that my own father had a much larger role in the story of the Kennedy assassination and its aftermath than Russell did. Anyone with more than a casual knowledge of the events surrounding the assassination and its investigation has seen my father's work without knowing it. Any FBI disclosures related to wiretaps may also bear out his role. The story of the organization Russell Bufalino headed is the story of family life and death in the very thick of what authors Robert P. Walensky and William A. Hastie have called the Anthracite Labor Wars. The story's scope encompasses the Industrial Revolution, one entire fossil fuel economy, several labor movements, prohibition, the brutal politics of assassination of the 1960s, and one enduring mystery. Chapter 4. The Old Soldier. I'm not scared anymore. Yabo Bufalino, Angelo, Bill's brother, tugged at his hospital gown, straining to cover his knees. It was early 1993. He had coded the night before at the nursing home. This had been his second or third resuscitation. They had beaten him back to life, and the big man looked it. He had been fighting a congestive heart condition, stubbornly refusing to die, literally informing the powers that he would climb up the pitchfork if he passed before he reached his 80th year. We both knew he wouldn't see his 81st. We talked the usual small talk, nothing deep, about the homestead, my mom, college, the family. He claimed a small victory. I beat them all, he said. He had outlived all, including his wealthier and more accomplished siblings. His younger brother, William, Hoffa's lawyer, had passed in 1990. His eldest brother, Charles, had passed years before. I knew Yabo for about 10 or 12 years toward the end of his life in the day-in and day-out relationship of a cousin and next-door neighbor. I was so plagued with guilt over his sister Mary's sudden passing that I couldn't help but check on him whenever I could. Sometimes it was just a, "Hey, Yabo, how you doing?" and sometimes it was sharing his lunch. I helped him with chores, the same as I had with Mary, pumping out his cellar, painting this or that, cleaning out Bill's downstairs office, picking up some bits of lore. I lost my own father in 1983, and Yabo, oddball that he was a great surrogate. I relied on him throughout the 1980s. By 1993, I was mostly away at school, and Yabo was living his last chapter. He had entered a nursing home the year before. When our visit finished, I left to return to grad school with a promise to visit again in a few weeks, as usual. I stopped at the nursing home on my way back to Bloomsburg. In Yabo's corner of the ward were a scattering of his possessions. There was the book I had bought him entitled Growing Up with Bootleggers, Gamblers, and Pigeons, which reminded him of his own youth, one of his carved canes, some photographs, a few clothes, and a yellow legal pad with some furious handwriting in red felt marker. "I'm not scared anymore" was ringing in my ears. I asked to sign the 1993 equivalent of a Do Not Resuscitate order. Before I could keep my promise to visit, Yabo, my dad's first cousin, my longtime next-door neighbor, and the last surrogate father I would ever need, had passed. I first met Yabo in 1963, when he and his brother Bill visited Pittston to see their sister Mary. Bill's mother had died in 1924 when he was about 5 years old. Mary, unwilling to marry the person she was promised to wed, opted to remain unmarried and help raise the boys instead with the assistance of their grandmother. Bill considered Mary to be more mother than sister, and so throughout Hoffa's later imprisonment in Lewisburg, when he visited Jimmy Hoffa weekly in prison, Bill would often drive the extra hour or so to Pittston to visit her at the family homestead. Licensed to practice only in Pennsylvania, Bill would later remodel Mary's downstairs, his father's former general store in the ground floor cellar, into an office and spend a large chunk of 3 years in local practice to satisfy requirements to enter the State Bar of Michigan. We called Mary Aunt Mary. She lived in the other half of the double block building her father and my grandfather had built in 1915. At the time of this first meeting in 1963, Yabo looked like an English gentleman fresh out of an episode of the Avengers TV series. He was well-dressed and well-groomed tree trunk of a man with a pencil-thin mustache. He was tall, over 6 feet, and he looked to me at age 6 like a giant. He smelled of Old Spice. There was the hint of a slice at the front lobe of his Roman nose that, for all I know, was the result of an acne scar. It looked more like a blade was involved. It made him look dangerous. He was holding a Franklin half-dollar above my head, just out of my reach. "I'm sorry, teacher," he said, for me to repeat, "but it's confidential between him and me." It was a simple lesson, a gesture of goodwill to a young cousin just about to start school. A bit of life advice that would advance Yabo to an old age. When I quoted the phrase and earned the half-dollar, I wanted to thank him, but at age 5, I didn't know how. I tried to kiss him. You'd have thought I pulled a gun on him, and I laughed as he ran back into Mary's door. It was 1963. Kennedy was still president as I, just about to enter the first grade, learned from my father's first cousin Yabo the fundamentals of omerta. At Yabo's funeral, his nephew, Bill's son, William Bufalino II, eulogized him, saying, in part, "I was 2 or 3 years old, and Yabo was in my house every day. I couldn't wrap my mouth around the name Yabo, so I called him Uncle Wow." His voice cracked when he said it. It moved me. In the family, we called William II Billy Boy. He was just all right. I attended Yabo's funeral reception by invitation of his family. Dressed as I was in one or the other of a blue or copper 3-piece polyester suit, I was surprised to find that I was not the most out-of-place character present. Maybe he sensed that, or maybe I have just got that kind of face, but he came right over to me. He was a short man, powerfully built. He had come in from Detroit for the funeral, probably with Billy Boy. He was not unattractive per se, but there was, about the shape of his head, neck, and shoulders, a kind of cartoon mole appearance. He was wearing a black t-shirt with slacks and a sport coat. Without introducing himself, he squared up in front of me, extended his hand, and blurted out, "Yabo was like a father to me." The man spent the next 2 hours with me, and I don't know why. I was anything but bored. He shared every story Yabo had never told about the Stork, later renamed to Story Club in Detroit, which Yabo and his brothers ran for Angelo Melli, the Detroit Partnership's consigliere, about working security at Cobo Hall, and about Teamsters business and travels with Hoffa. The man held nothing back to the point that I could hardly absorb any of it, but I came away understanding why the Yabo I knew never spoke about any of his life in Detroit in the same way that soldiers don't talk about war. It explained those dark shadows under his eyes. Yabo plugged along every day I knew him, took his life day to day, and enjoyed a little horse betting, socializing, and dancing, but privately it seemed that something bothered him all the later years of his life. Altogether, the meeting with the stranger was so bizarre, I don't think I even asked his name. When the reception was over, he told me he had been a technical advisor on Danny DeVito's movie Hoffa, which had released the year before. Then he pulled out a very old and authentic-looking Teamsters card. Written on the back was a short sentence: "Give this man anything he wants." It was signed by Jimmy Hoffa. Russell passed the year after Yabo in 1994. I thought at the time that the notoriety of the family name would subside and we could all get about having more normal lives. The flow of publications, scholarly and popular, about Russell that began with "I Heard You Paint Houses" would prove me wrong. Martin Scorsese's The Irishman was released with its cast of usual suspects in Robert De Niro as Frank Sheeran, Al Pacino as Jimmy Hoffa, Joe Pesci as Russell Bufalino, and Harvey Keitel as Angelo Bruno. Pesci floored me as Russell. Everybody did good work. I thought Ray Romano was well cast as Bill Bufalino. Altogether, the movie forced me to realize that Russell's notoriety would not fade within my own lifetime. It helped drive me to set some records straight. Chapter 5. The Riddle. Everybody knows where Jimmy Hoffa is. He's buried at Giants Stadium, in the foundation of Detroit's Renaissance Center, or he's pressed into a crushed car. He's on this or that farm, in this or that landfill, in a drum full of this or that. In a handful of deathbed confessions, a select group of connected people sincerely report that they personally had been entrusted with or had direct knowledge of the disposal of a body supposedly transported from Detroit, Michigan, to locations as far away as New Jersey and Florida. It seems that some deliberate misdirection and intentional misinformation was disseminated in the aftermath of Hoffa's disappearance. It's possible that some of the parties who honestly believed their version of the events had been intentionally abused by the false leads. A person of any conscience might feel a weight on their chest to have such knowledge or belief and would, at the very least, pass it on, as they did, to the next party to deal with or reveal at some safe time. And yet, however widely held the belief that Jimmy Hoffa's body exists to be found, the idea has some notable detractors. William D'Elia, Russell Bufalino's hand-picked successor, tells a version of this story in his biography, The Life We Chose. The locally popular version departs from the published version, but more or less expresses the same idea, and I personally like it better. Billy D'Elia was visited by agents of the FBI while in prison. They had a lead on a burial place for Jimmy Hoffa, and they wanted to see if he would corroborate the story before they began an excavation. "He's not there," said the big man. "Well, where is he, then?" asked the agents. "I don't know where he is." Then, after a pause for effect, he added, "But he's not there." Mr. D'Elia adamantly dismisses the Frank Sheeran story as related in I Heard You Paint Houses as an outrageous fiction. Only one element of Sheeran's narrative survives his criticism. Sheeran expressed his belief that Hoffa.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.